Season 3 of The Handmaid's Tale picks up right where Season 2 left off in the aftermath of letting Emily and baby Nicole go. Now, just like with last season's recap, I'm going to go from Offred to June to whatever her new name is a few times. Just bear with me on that. But June is kind of walking back, and Commander Lawrence sees her and says, "Are you serious? You didn't go?" And June says, "I have a daughter, and I need to get her first. So take me to her, let me get her, and then we'll head back." She also kind of threatens him a little bit, claiming that if they find out what he did, he could be on the wall, and he respects this, so he ends up taking her to the Mackenzie household. And with the help of the Martha, she's able to get into the Mackenzie household, and right before she's ready to go into her daughter's room, she sees sirens outside and knows that they're coming for her. June is arrested, and right before she's taken out, the mother of the household, Mrs. Mackenzie, comes and says, You can't keep doing this. We're appreciative that you gave birth to her, but this isn't good for her. And June says, I'm not the one confusing her. You guys are the one confusing her. I'm her mother. It looks like the conversation is over, but once again, right before she's about to leave, June asks Mrs. Mackenzie what she like. And her and Mrs. Mackenzie are having a conversation about what Hannah likes, what she doesn't like. And at the end of it, Mrs. Mackenzie once again begs June, stop coming here. It's just confusing her. June is taken to the Waterfords' house after this, and that's not a great situation. Because after Serena came back, Fred said, we have to alert the police, and Serena says, no, we have to give her time to get away. Serena's basically admitting to Fred, I'm the one who let this happen. So this forms a toxic situation for June, because when she comes back, Serena's incensed because she thought she was getting away, and Fred is incensed because he thinks they're all going to die for this. They just let a kid escape Gilead. Fred starts screaming, where's my child? But June doesn't even acknowledge him. She just looks at Serena and says, Serena, Nicole is safe. Serena loses it and says, I gave Nicole to you. I didn't give Nicole to a killer in Emily. And June explains, I have another daughter here, and you guys hunted us down. And in a way, this is how I felt. And that seems to hit home for Serena, and they end up embracing. And that leaves the commander left trying to pick up the pieces of his broken home. But the Waterfords aren't the only people that are pissed off at June. Nick is also pissed off, and he calls her selfish, saying, there's never going to be another chance to get out. That was it. A lot of people risk their lives to get you out, and you just screwed it up. But June keeps reiterating that she couldn't just leave Hannah in Gilead. The next day, Fred has to go to the office and report exactly what happened, and Serena asks, what are you going to tell him? He says, I'm going to tell him that Emily tried to kill Aunt Lydia, Emily stole Nicole, and you and Offred did everything you guys could to keep her in Gilead. That's the only way to keep our household intact, and for us not to end up on a wall. Serena once again tells Fred, though, that it was my idea to let Nicole go, and Fred says, God put me in charge of this house. I've got to try to keep it together. But Serena's still dealing with the fact that Fred cut off her damn pinky. So when Fred leaves, she decides to burn that house to the ground. Now, everybody's able to escape as they just go to the sidewalk and watch the Waterford house burn. As the dust clears, the commander, along with Nick, show up, and Nick says goodbye to June and says take care of yourself because she now has to go get punished for sneaking into the Mackenzie household. She's also going to be reassigned, and she finds out that her new household is going to be Commander Lawrence, and this is the same guy who helped get Emily out. Commander Lawrence asks her, are you going to be a problem? And she has a massive smile on her face and says, no, not at all. We also found out what happened to Emily and the baby. Emily was dropped off close to the border, but is having to elude the border patrol. That includes planes and helicopters who are looking for her. At one point, she has to get into a very cold river in order to hide from them. Her and baby Nicole are actually swept under the water at one point, and they do make it to shore, but baby Nicole is unresponsive. Until finally, she starts coughing up some water. Emily is approached by a couple of police officers who are asking her if she's seeking asylum, which she obviously is, because Emily and Nicole made it to Canada. They're taken to a hospital where everybody in the hospital stops what they're doing and is staring at Emily, and they just start giving her a standing ovation for escaping Gilead. Emily also meets up with Moira and Luke and tells Luke that your wife helped save my life, and this is her child. And during June's punishment, she does find out from another handmaid that Emily did escape and did make it to Canada safe and sound. In episode 2, June gets a new walking partner, a girl named Of Matthew, and this girl is not like any of the other walking partners. Most of the girls in Gilead absolutely despise the role and the fact that they're stuck in Gilead, but this girl seems very obedient to not just the rules, but seems to buy into everything that they're teaching. All the bullshit, all the nonsense, she seems to be a part of it, and it doesn't seem like June can trust her. Unfortunately for June, it doesn't seem like the Marthas trust any of the handmaids after June decided not to escape to Canada. And now being in a new house, she takes it upon herself to try to befriend some of the Marthas in the Lawrence home. But before she can really figure out a way to do that, one of the Marthas comes in and says, hey, they're waiting for you in the parlor, and that's where Aunt Lydia is just sitting there, waiting for June to come in. Yes, she actually lived. And she's just doing a checkup on June and seeing how the new household is fitting her and also how she's fitting the new household. The commander says she's been great, all the ceremonies have been fine, and Mrs. Lawrence says she's been great and hasn't been disrespectful at all. And at the end of the meeting, Aunt Lydia says that she wants to see where June is staying, so she hobbles over to the stairs and then falls. And when June goes to help her, Aunt Lydia shocks her with a cattle prodder and is just chastising her, yelling at her, saying that they should have put her on the wall for what she did to the Mackenzie household. Aunt Lydia leaves, but it's pretty clear that she's not a fan of the fact that June is still breathing. But Aunt Lydia's cattle prodder has left a mark, and so June needs to go into the kitchen to retrieve some bandages and burn cream. And when she does that, she notices the Marthas are gossiping, but they're not gossiping about her. They're gossiping about trying to get somebody out of Gilead, and she wants to help. She feels like this is the best chance to get in good with the Marthas again. And while all the Marthas, including June, are talking about what they're going to do, Commander Lawrence walks in and notices that he doesn't recognize one of the Marthas and says, I'm going to get you somebody to walk you home because I don't like people that I don't know in my house. But this is the woman that they're trying to escape out of Gilead, and if somebody walks her home, she's not going to escape. So June takes it in her own hands and walks into the living room and tells Commander Lawrence that she's trying to escape and you can't have somebody walk her home. And he goes, well, I don't know her. And June says, you didn't know me, but you helped me out. And he says, fine, it's your funeral. Go ahead, do what you want to do. So all the Marthas along with June head out, and they're all dressed as Marthas, including June. They all have passes that will allow them to get out of their current section. And you're seeing parts of Gilead that you haven't seen before. It's basically the industrial part of Gilead that handmaids aren't allowed around because of the chemicals in the air. But it's very stressful for all the handmaids because they don't know if their passes are definitely going to work. Luckily for them, though, the passes do work and they're able to get through the military checkpoint. They take the woman to a garage and tell her to hide. Somebody will be there for her, but this is as far as they can go, and they start heading back. And when they head back, they see soldiers heading in the direction of where they were just coming from. Later that night, while they're washing up for dinner, June and the other Marthas start hearing a noise outside, and when they open the door, it's one of the women they were with and another woman who's been shot by soldiers. They don't really know what to do, so they put her in the basement, and they're trying to keep it from Commander Lawrence. But of course, he finds out, and when he calls him upstairs, he wants to know what the hell is going on. The one Martha lies to him and says that they saw a rat, but he sees completely through that lie. And June tells him the truth. She says there's somebody hurt, they're downstairs, and he says it's the woman from before. And she says, no, it's actually somebody different this time. At this point, though, soldiers have knocked on the door, and they've alerted Commander Lawrence that they're looking for someone, though they don't suspect that that person is in the house. Mrs. Lawrence has brought them in and asked them if the commander has offered them tea and coffee and any kind of drinks whatsoever. And while this is going on, June has noticed that there's a huge blood spot on the wall, and she starts frantically trying to get rid of it before those soldiers see it. But Mrs. Lawrence ushers the soldiers into another room, sees the blood spot, sees June, and asks one of the Marthas if she can start cleaning up that blood spot. So Mrs. Lawrence seems to have her back. June heads down to the basement to help the girl that's been shot, and they're trying to get her to be quiet, but she's been shot and she's not being quiet. The woman ends up passing away before they can get her out, and the commander comes down and sees the body. And he starts yelling at June, calling her selfish and telling her that she's a child who doesn't think about the consequences of her actions, which is something that's kind of been a trend with June in this show. June tries to make nice and asks how the commander's wife is doing, and that's when the commander really loses his shit. He yells at June to never ask about his wife. He then says that this whole thing was a mistake, and June says, we didn't know she was going to come back. And he says, no, that wasn't a mistake. Having you here in this house is a mistake. He tells June to take care of the body, and when another Martha tries to help June in that, he calls the Martha back in and literally makes June do it all herself, including digging the grave in the freezing cold dirt. The next day, as June walks to the market, she notices that the commander's wife is literally planting flowers exactly where she buried that body. Now, over in Canada, a few people are having a tough time transitioning back to normal life, and one of those people is Emily. The other one being Luke, and Luke is having a tough time because now he's got this woman in his house who he doesn't know, who brought him this baby from his wife who's still in Gilead, and obviously he's not the father of it. And he's kind of blaming Emily for this because Emily is not June. And Emily's having a tough time as she goes to doctor's offices, gets blood work done. She gets the phone number to a shrink that she can contact, also a plastic surgeon who can help fix her, because down there, They did stuff. But Emily is yet to call her wife. And finally, when she leaves the eye doctor, she opens up her cell phone, calls her wife, and her wife is so shocked to hear her voice that she literally just stops the car in dead traffic. Episode 3 starts out with June staring at a bunch of hanged handmaids and Marthas, and she's trying to figure out if she knows any of them. She realizes that she's going to need some allies, and one of them has to be Commander Lawrence. She heads back to the house where Commander Lawrence will be hosting a bunch of other commanders because he doesn't like to travel, so if they're going to have a meeting, he's going to come to them. And he's also gotten a new Martha in the house because he fired the one who kept lying to him. June is trying to make up for her events in the last episode, and she goes to the commander and asks, can I get the door? And he says, I don't know, can you? I mean, I'm just asking, what's the punishment for a handmaid who answers the door. And there's an awkward pause, and finally he gets up and says, I guess he can. So Commander Lawrence goes and lets the other commanders in, and one of those commanders is Fred. And this gives June the opportunity to talk to Fred alone, and she says, look, you were good to me. And one of the reasons I'm still alive is because of you, but now I'm stuck with him. And you need to tell me everything I need to know that can keep me alive in this household. And Commander Waterford says, we don't really have any answers for you because we've all been trying to figure him out since day one. All I know is he doesn't like being bored. Now the meeting starts and June is summoned in to start pouring drinks because the new girl isn't doing it fast enough, and that's when she sees a new commander, and it's Nick the driver. He's been promoted. Congrats, Nick. But this is pretty shocking for June, who had no idea this was happening. Now, the conversation at the moment is about women, and Commander Lawrence says women can be useful, but then he completely embarrasses June and makes her go get a book off the shelf and hand it to him and said, see? There, she's useful. June leaves the room of commanders that are laughing at her at this point, and it leaves June fuming. So at this point, she's got the art of seduction that she'll try on Commander Lawrence. She heads up to his office and offers him tea, and he says, yeah, it's been a long day. And he asks, do you think you're good at managing people? And June says, no, not really. And he stands up and says, you look like you'd be good at making friends, and they get pretty close to one another. He also says, it looks like you'd be good at intimacy, and she thanks him. And once again, they're getting closer and closer. And right before it looks like something's going to happen, he just starts laughing and says, I can't believe Fred Waterford fell for this. He then poses the question of why is it that women don't want to be used for their bodies, yet they use their bodies to get what they want? June fires back with maybe it's because men are just easily distracted, and this causes a little bit of a fight between the two. Commander Lawrence brings up what she did at the Waterfords and says, you literally left that house in ashes, to which June replies with, I did what I had to do. Commander Lawrence then says, you think that if you get me to like you, then I'll help you. And she says, I think you'd actually try to do the right thing. Because you let Emily escape with that baby, and you let the Marthas run a resistance network out of your own house. To which he claims that you need to let the rebels blow off a little steam, or they'll blow everything to bits. And in regards to Emily, he says that he knew she was smart, and she could help the world better if she was free in Canada rather than in Gilead. And then Commander Lawrence hits a nerve when he says, if you were smart, you would have gotten on that truck. This really pisses off June, and says, you know why I couldn't get on that truck. To which Commander Lawrence replies with, I think I love your daughter more than you do, because I'm trying to replenish the human race for her, and what the hell are you doing? This pisses off June even more, who screams, I'm trying to be her mother. And Lawrence just digs the knife deeper and deeper, saying, you've met her mother, Mrs. Mackenzie, who was a great woman, and even before all this happened, did you know that she sent orphans in Africa, when there were orphans in Africa, a bunch of food baskets to help them out? What did you do? All you did was edit esoteric books that nobody was going to read. June starts to walk out but thinks better of it and comes back at him and says, you used to write those esoteric books that nobody read. And it must suck seeing those numbers on a spreadsheet turn into real people who were executed, and knowing that if nobody had ever read your books, we all would have been better off. It must be hell being a man like you. And you know, I get it. I get why you would hold yourself up in this house all day, playing games with people's heads and doing a good deed every once in a while just so you can sleep at night. And this kind of surprises Lawrence, and the only response he has is to say how tempting it is to invent a humanity for anybody at all, and then forces June to take a drive with him. June and Commander Lawrence drive to what appears to be an airline hangar, and when they get inside, there's a bunch of women in cages, and Commander Lawrence says, I've been able to save 5 of these women. Now, the rest of them are going to the colonies, but 5 of them will become Marthas. June wants to know why he can't save all of them, because none of them should go to the colonies, but he says there's not enough openings. And not only that, you're going to choose which 5 I save. So here's all the information you need on them. Choose wisely. June immediately says, I'm not doing that. And Lawrence says, if you're not going to do it, then they all die. June claims, I'm not going to be responsible for their deaths. You'll be. Commander Lawrence says, that's not going to matter to these women. They're going to be dead. At that point, it's not going to matter who's at fault, but clearly it's important to you. And this kind of goes back to June just being selfish. But even after that, June says, I'm not doing it, and just storms back to the car. As she sits in her room just stewing and thinking about her next move, she gets a visit from her old friend, Nick the driver. I'm sorry, Nick the commander. Nick tells her that he was just promoted to commander and he doesn't know anything about Lawrence and really can't even help her out. This doesn't sit well with June, who says, you could literally get me transferred out of here to your place and we could be together. And he says, no, we can't, because I'm going to the front lines of Chicago. Chicago's about to fall, and him going to the front lines, everybody knows, front lines, you're probably going to die. And this is nothing more than just really a goodbye for the two. He's also not just coming to say goodbye. He's coming for that ass. And boy, does he get it. The next day, June is summoned to the living room, and there is Serena, and she's having a real rough go of it. Her and Fred are basically split up at this point, and her mother has come over to kind of watch over her. Her mother has forced a prayer group on Serena and told the entire prayer group exactly what's going on in her life and her marriage, just being overall really intrusive. And now she has all these people praying for all these intimate things that she doesn't want out there. And this is kind of further proof that her faith in this whole system is waning. After this prayer group, Serena freaks out on her mom and says that she never should have brought these people there, and all you want me to do is go back with Fred. And her mom says the cold truth is, you're really nobody without being Mrs. Waterford. So you guys should just play the happy couple and stop being a petulant child about this. Because the cold reality is there's not really room in this world for a woman like you if you're not Mrs. Waterford. By the way, Fred, if you're wondering where he is, he's at Jezebel's practicing a speech he's going to give to his wife to win her back in front of a fine-looking Gilead hooker. So he's got his priorities straight. But this blow-up with her mother has forced Serena to the Lawrence household to meet with June. Serena starts asking June about baby Nicole and what they think baby Nicole is like right now and what she liked and what she didn't like. It's a lot like what June was doing to Mrs. Mackenzie, honestly. At one point, something gets brought up and June says, I think she got that from you. And Serena says, she's not my baby. And June says, the fact that you let her go is the most motherly thing you could do. Is the most motherly thing anyone can do. You guaranteed a better life for your child, and the reality is this world is not going to help women like me and you. We have to look out for each other. We need to stick up for each other. The definition of girl power, the Spice Girls would be thrilled. June says, if you could just think about all the mothers who had their children taken away from them, and Serena cuts her off and says, just like you. And June just kind of nods. June says, there's got to be something you can do. Serena says, that's not really what I came here for. And June says, it's clear that men hate us in this world, and you've got to try harder. And Serena admits that she's scared, but you've got to use that. You've got to make lemons out of lemonade. And that's pretty much what June does, because she picks 5 women from the airport to be Marthas. And she picks wisely. She goes to the Martha in her own house and says, I have 5 new women for the resistance. An engineer, an IT tech, a journalist, a lawyer, and a thief. In episode 4, the entire community heads to the church for basically a group baptism of all the new children that were born in Gilead, and that includes June and her walking partner of Matthew. Aunt Lydia lets June know that she's reserved certain seating for all of the handmaids who had children, and that includes of Matthew. And June says, you had a baby? And she says 3, and that really takes June aback, because 3 kids is a lot for anybody, but especially in this world. During the ceremony, June notices of Matthew's child and says she's beautiful. But of Matthew kind of just brushes the comment off and just says, yes, they all are. And this is kind of further proof that she's not all there. Now, after the ceremony, the Putnams have invited everybody, including the handmaids, to their house for hors d'oeuvres and kind of a post-baptism party, if you will. And this usually doesn't happen. Usually the handmaids aren't invited to these type of events. And when they walk in the door, of Matthew makes a comment like, we shouldn't even be here. This isn't right. And June says, shut up. Just go have fun. As of Matthew walks away, June is combing the living room of all the commanders and their wives, and she sees Fred Waterford and just starts staring at him. And that's when Serena comes up from behind her and kind of surprises her a little bit. June says, I didn't see you at the ceremony. She says, yeah, I didn't want to really be a nuisance. June sees Serena staring at all of the wives, and she says, you know, you're a leader. You should get over there. Serena says, no, because half of them left me. And June makes the comment of, yeah, half of them left you, but half of them stayed with you. At this point, Fred has noticed her and came over, and she's still being extremely cold to Fred Waterford. She's made it abundantly clear that she's not here for him. She's here to support the community and the Putnams. At this point, June makes her way into the kitchen where most of the handmaids are bitching and moaning about Aunt Lydia because Aunt Lydia has been even worse since the accident. And the only one to stick up for Aunt Lydia is of Matthew. She says, you can't blame Aunt Lydia for all these actions. And it's just amazing to everybody in the room that she actually buys into this stuff. She's had 3 kids. She isn't close with really any of them. She doesn't have any motherly instinct to her. And she seems to understand and agree with all of the practices of Gilead, even though obviously, it doesn't really benefit her. But when of Matthew makes this comment, it pisses off the entire room. And June walks by giving her a death stare that would put her 6 feet under the grave. Luckily for of Matthew, though, there won't be a murder today because Commander Waterford walks into the room and nicely tells the girls to get out, go enjoy the buffet, I'll deal with the consequences later. And this leaves Commander Waterford in the room alone with June. Fred is coming to June hat in hand, knowing that she has a good relationship with Serena and asking her to help her mend this fence with his wife. June says, I think what she needs is more power. She doesn't like sewing. She wants to be a human being. She has ideas that could help this community. Obviously, keep it behind closed doors, but let her live her life. And Fred seems open to this suggestion. So June heads off and searches for Serena, and she finds her in the pool area smoking and tells her that Fred wants to make amends. And even though Serena doesn't want to do this, June kind of convinces her by saying, you wear the dress, but you pull the string behind closed doors. Be the puppet master. Even though everyone's going to think it's Fred's ideas, it's your ideas. And Serena seems to buy into this idea. So out they walk from the pool area, and June kind of gives Commander Waterford a nod. And Serena walks over to the Putnams who are holding their baby, but she's not the only one who walks in the room because Janine also walks into the room. She sees that as her child and starts walking closer and closer towards the Putnams. And even though June is trying to stop her, she's just too far away to do so. Janine says how beautiful the child is and asks if she can hold her. And at this point, Aunt Lydia has made her way in and looks like she's about to go after her, but Mrs. Putnam allows it. Janine's holding the baby and trying to console her while she cries and eventually gives the baby back and thanks Mrs. Putnam and says how lucky the baby is to have such a beautiful home under the Putnams. But that's when she makes the mistake of saying, you know, she could have a brother or sister. I want to be back in this house. I want to help do this again. I want to be with this baby. And even though the Putnams say that's not a good idea, it pisses off Janine even more, and she screams, isn't that what you guys teach us? You guys want us to have babies, so I'm trying to do that. And at this point, Aunt Lydia's heard enough and just starts railing on her, beating her over and over and over again in front of all of these commanders and their wives. June has to jump in front of Janine just to stop the beatings, and she yells at Aunt Lydia to stop. And at this point, Aunt Lydia takes it back and notices that everyone in the room is staring at her aghast. And even she's a little amazed at what she just did. And Lydia knows she crossed the line and doesn't even have words to defend it. She just slowly backs out of the room and goes crying because she knows that she crossed the line. Janine is dragged away unconscious, and Of Matthew says that's what she deserves. Of Matthew's the worst. As all the handmaids are leaving, Serena goes over to June and tells her where she would find her daughter, what time, what school she goes to. It's not going to be easy for June, but it's a start. This will help June form a plan to get her daughter out of Gilead. But just before June's about to leave, a soldier rushes in and demands to see Commander Waterford. And this kind of piques June's interest, so she walks over to the room where the commander, Mrs. Waterford, and the soldier are, and they're staring at a screen. The soldier asks, is that your handmaid? And Commander Waterford says, former handmaid. And the soldier says, we need to confirm that this is him. And the soldier shows June a video of Luke holding baby Nicole at a rally. Now, this is the first time that both of the women have seen baby Nicole since she gave her to Emily to escape Gilead. This is also the first time that June is seeing her husband in years. So while all the men in the room are mortified, all the women in the room have kind of a smile on their face. And June does confirm, yes, that is my husband. But Serena is laughing and saying, look how big she got. And June leaves the room and is crying, but it's happy tears because of the fact that she was able to get out and she's seeing it firsthand. And finally, up in Canada, Emily is trying to get reacclimated to everyday life with her wife. But it's extremely awkward for the two because of the fact that they haven't seen each other in forever. She's able to see her son for the first time in years, and the mother decided to put the son in school just to give them both a little bit of time. Emily asks, does he even remember me? And then they enter his room where he's got a bunch of pictures of the two of them, along with a hand-drawn picture of her as a superhero escaping Gilead. Eventually, Oliver, the little boy, does show up and says, I can't hug you until you're ready. And she says, how about we just wait until we're both ready? It's a really adorable scene. And then at night, Oliver asks her to read him a bedtime story. And while she's reading it, the other mother is crying, and this kind of forces Emily to cry. And Oliver just picks up right where she left off and starts reading the bedtime story to everybody in the room. But this goes to show just how hard the reacclimation process is. In episode 5, June and Of Matthew are walking to the market, and Of Matthew tells June that she's praying for baby Nicole. And June says, thank you. And she says, I'm praying that your husband returns baby Nicole to Gilead because he can't be this stupid. And I know that you can't be this stupid to have married somebody who would have stolen a baby. To no one's surprise, this pisses off June, and she says, bite me. But there is the matter of baby Nicole. And Gilead, along with all the commanders, are having a meeting about what to do about baby Nicole and getting her back. Now, the commanders are trying to contact the Canadian government, but it's not really going well. And because of all this information, Fred Waterford feels like he should invite Serena into the meeting. And he does that, and he shows her all of the information they have on baby Nicole, including what percentile she is, the fact that she's got a tooth now. And they also give an update on exactly who Luke is. Eventually, all the commanders leave, and Fred looks at Serena and says, I thought this was what you wanted. I thought you wanted our baby in Canada. And Serena cries and says, I want to be with our daughter. I want this whole thing to be over. And I understand that's not possible right now, but I want to be in her life. So Fred, desperate to be in good graces with Serena, has devised a plan, and he heads to Commander Lawrence's house and asks June if she can call her husband and arrange a meeting between her husband, baby Nicole, and the Waterfords on one last goodbye. Now, at first, June wants no parts of this and says no. But Serena starts talking to June, trying to convince her to do this deed for them, and she says, all right, well, if I do this, you get to see Nicole, but what do I get? Mrs. Waterford says, what do you want? And June says, I want you to owe me. So June calls up Luke, and this is the first time the two have spoken, by the way, in years. And she asks Luke to do this thing and meet with the Waterfords. And he doesn't want to do it and says, I'm definitely not meeting with Commander Waterford. I'll meet with her, but I'm not meeting with him. But he agrees that he will bring baby Nicole to the airport to say goodbye to Mrs. Waterford. After the two hang up, Luke breaks down and starts crying because this is the first time he's heard from his wife in years since the two went their separate ways in the woods. Commander Lawrence notices that this is probably an emotional moment for June and tries to hand her a tissue, but June is staying strong and stone-faced and just stands up and walks out of the room. Later that night, June ends up meeting with Mrs. Lawrence, and this is the first time the two have really been able to talk. And Mrs. Lawrence tells her that the important thing is that Luke heard the love in her voice, and sometimes words don't do it justice. She reveals that back in college, Commander Lawrence used to make her mixtapes, and she still has all those mixtapes down in the basement. Mrs. Lawrence also says that she misses the guy who used to make her mixtapes, and June says, there's nothing wrong with holding on to a sliver of somebody because you know that that sliver of somebody is still in them. After this conversation, June goes downstairs and finds the box of mixtapes and starts listening to one of them. The next day, Mrs. Waterford is ready to go, and she's actually got a gift for baby Nicole that she's going to give her, and right before she gets up, the Martha of the house, Rita, ends up handing her a package. Mrs. Waterford asks what it is, but Rita says it's not addressed to me, and it's also not addressed to Mrs. Waterford either. So Mrs. Waterford quickly puts it in her bag before Commander Waterford notices. Mrs. Waterford gets on the plane and heads to Canada, and when she arrives, she's greeted by the guy from the American government who tried to get her to stay in Canada the last time she was here back in season 2. He has Mrs. Waterford change clothes because he wants her to blend in better, and then finally she's able to see baby Nicole in the airport. Now at first Luke is extremely rude to her, and it's understandable why, but he basically tells her to fuck off. And after the initial squabbling of, well, you're not her mother and, well, you're not her father, Luke really hits home by saying, this little girl will never know who you are. You're not going to be in her life. You mean nothing to her. This really upsets Serena, as you can imagine, and she says, your wife wanted Nicole in Canada, and I wanted Nicole in Canada. So just respect her wishes, because I protected your wife. Now, this comment really shocks Luke, and he's quite taken aback, and it seems like he's going to flip out, but cooler heads prevail, and eventually he offers Nicole to Serena to hold. He also takes the present that Serena brought for Nicole. Eventually, the meeting ends, and as Serena and the guy from the American government are walking back, he says, hey, the offer still stands, but Serena says, I got a home, and it's in Gilead. When she closed the door to change back, she just loses it. She freaks out because she just said goodbye to this little girl who she truly does love. But she looks on the floor and she sees the package that Rita gave her, and it's addressed to Luke. She does get that package to Luke somehow, and she's able to compose herself. And when she gets on the plane, you see that there's a phone in her bag that was obviously put there by the guy from the American government. When she arrives back in Gilead, she sees Fred and says she's perfect. And now it's over. But Fred says it doesn't have to be if you don't want it to be. Now, what you learn about that package is it's a mixtape, and it was the same mixtape that June was listening to from Commander Lawrence's house, and she recorded over it to get a message to Luke. In a nutshell, she tells Luke that she slept with another guy, that this baby that is living in his house and is in front of him was a baby born out of love. The father is Nick the driver, and he actually met him, and this baby wasn't born out of rape and hate, but actual love. And that maybe that it's time for him to move on because she's in Gilead doing what she needs to do to survive. She had to create a life for herself in Gilead, and he now needs to create a life for himself, along with baby Nicole in Canada. Unfortunately, the June that you married is gone, and while there's a piece of me still in there, I'm a new person. As you can imagine, getting broken up via text message sucks. Getting broken up via mixtape is even worse, and Luke kind of breaks down a little bit and starts crying. It's a tough pill to swallow. Now, the next day, you find out what Fred meant when he said this doesn't have to be the end. While June is in the market, soldiers grab her and usher her to a film studio where they have her put on a whole new outfit, and they're basically filming a propaganda video to get baby Nicole back that they can put out for the entire world so that the entire world feels bad for them, and they force the Canadian government to give them back Nicole. But while they're filming this, June is fuming. Clenched fist, sour face. She is not happy. In episode 6, Commander Lawrence lets June know that phase 2 of Commander Waterford's plan to get Nicole back is to head to DC and make some more propaganda films, so they're going to borrow her. While on the train at DC, as June looks outside, she notices that they turned the Washington Monument from the Washington Monument into a cross, and this kind of disgusts her in a way. But when she arrives at the train station, she's told by Aunt Lydia that they don't fool around in the Capitol. You have to stick strictly to the rules, and she's noticing that a lot of the handmaids that are walking around have their mouths covered. When they arrive up the escalator, Aunt Lydia tells her to go into a circle and wait for the commander. And she goes into this circle with about 3 to 4 other handmaids and is kind of isolated. Eventually, though, Commander Waterford with Mrs. Waterford and Martha arrive. And Rita and June are talking about what the hell's going on, but also she can't believe that Mrs. Waterford is going along with this. But she has no idea because she hasn't had a chance to talk to her. Now, everyone's going to be staying at a DC commander's residence. His name's Commander Winslow. And when the family arrives, Commander Winslow kind of makes it known that this wasn't his idea to host the Waterfords. It was his wives. As Commander Winslow and Commander Waterford are talking about how delicate this situation is and how important one image is, all of a sudden his kids come into the room. And yes, I did say kids because there's about 5 to 6 of them. This takes everybody aback. When the Martha and June head up to bed, they both mention to each other that they've never seen this many kids in one residence before. And Rita says the most I've ever seen is about 3. But 6 is ridiculous. Now, June will be rooming with the handmaid in the household. And when the handmaid enters the room, June starts trying to make small talk, but the handmaid isn't answering back. Doesn't stop June, though. She keeps persisting with the small talk, and the handmaid still isn't answering back. And finally, June looks over and makes eye contact with her and sees that the reason she had her mouth covered is because they've had their mouths sewn shut. And this truly horrifies June. The next day, June heads with the commander and Mrs. Waterford and Aunt Lydia to go make more propaganda films. And even Aunt Lydia notices the girls with their mouths sewn shut. And she doesn't seem to be a big fan of this. As Commander Waterford is going through exactly how they're going to film this and what shots he wants, Nick the driver shows up. Nick the commander shows up. Now, Commander Waterford knows that Nick the driver is baby Nicole's real father. So he has Nick the driver stand in his place along with June and Mrs. Waterford to get the, quote, right shot. Nick also tells Commander Waterford that he'll be leaving for Chicago in the front lines any day now, and that's why he is in DC. He's literally just waiting for the order. Commander Waterford lets June know that when she kneels, all the handmaids will kneel in unison with her, and that's a pretty important feature of this propaganda film, even though June is disgusted by it and doesn't want to have anything to do with it. When they get back to the Winslow household, June is finally able to get a one-on-one with Serena, and she's pleading with her to not do this. But to her dismay, Serena is in on it. Serena says, seeing that baby changed everything for me. And June says, yeah, it changed everything for you, but it didn't change everything for baby Nicole because she's still better off in Canada and not in Gilead. June is pleading with her to make this right and just go with what they agreed to keep baby Nicole in Canada. But it seems like Serena has made up her mind, and they're interrupted by Commander Waterford, who lets them know that the Swiss will be mediating negotiations to get baby Nicole back to Gilead. The Swiss interview the Waterfords, and as they're exiting down the stairs, they ask if they can interview June. The Waterfords have no problem with this because they think that they're going to be in the room, but the Swiss make it clear they don't want them in the room. They want to interview June one-on-one, and this leaves June with a massive smile on her face, because she'll actually be able to tell the Swiss where baby Nicole should be. Right before she gets up to go to the interview, Serena sits down next to her and says, don't do anything stupid. But June gets up, gives Commander Waterford a look, and heads right into the interview with the Swiss. In the interview, June makes it very clear that I am the baby's mother, neither of the Waterfords are related to baby Nicole, and I want this baby in Canada. And the Swiss make it very clear that Gilead is very powerful, they have a large army, and Canada is not ready to go to war over baby Nicole. So June says, what do you guys need? And the Swiss say, Gilead has been a black box. We have no idea how it operates. We also know that you got a tape to your husband in Canada saying that Nick is the father of baby Nicole. So June says, all right, if I bring you Nick and he answers your questions, can you guarantee me that Nicole will stay in Canada? And they shake on it. After this meeting with the Swiss, Commander Waterford and Commander Winslow are playing pool, and Commander Winslow makes it known that he thought that Commander Waterford was weak. He had preconceived notions about him, but getting this meeting with the Swiss and getting one step closer to getting baby Nicole back has shown that he can be a huge asset, and maybe he can be a huge asset here in DC. And this would be a huge promotion for Commander Waterford. Now, somehow that night, June is able to get a message to Nick, and Nick and June meet up outside of the Winslow household, And after the initial kissing, she explains that he needs to meet with the Swiss to keep baby Nicole in Canada. Nick doesn't want to do it. He says that the Swiss have their own agenda. This is governments we're talking about. It's not that simple. But June says, you're going to the front lines. This is probably the only chance you have to act like a father to our daughter by going and meeting with the Swiss. He reluctantly agrees to do so. And the next day, he has that meeting with the Swiss. But June is in the dark because she's not in the meeting. So when the Swiss show up at the Winslow household and let it be known that their recommendation is to continue mediation, this throws June for a loop. She is pissed off. And June says, well, what did he not do? What did Nick not do? And the woman says, I don't think you know who Nick is. Our data shows this guy can't be trusted. After the woman leaves, June asks Serena, what did Nick do before becoming a driver for you guys? Serena tells her that he was a soldier in the Crusades, and this is the first time that June is hearing this. She had no idea that he fought for that side. She knew that he worked for him, obviously, but he doesn't fit the criteria, and she's shocked. The next day, June gets ready to film this propaganda movie, and Aunt Lydia comes and says, hey, there's one more thing before you put on your clothes. I'm going to need you to cover your mouth. June asks Aunt Lydia, do you agree with this? Do you think we should be silenced? And Aunt Lydia admits, no, I don't. And she's actually crying about this. At the end of this bonding experience, she asks Aunt Lydia if she can help her put on the mouth cover, and Aunt Lydia does, and they head off to film. And they're heading off to the Lincoln Memorial, which has been vandalized. Lincoln's head's cut off. The whole thing has been kind of destroyed. And while she's looking shocked at this famous memorial, Serena shows up and they start in with the insults. And Serena says, we're going to be away from each other pretty soon. We'll be in D.C. and you'll be back near Boston and we won't have to deal with each other. And June says, you're never going to get rid of me. Until both of my children are safe, you're never getting rid of me. June says, I trusted you to get her out, and Serena says, well, I trusted you to stay with her. And this bickering goes back and forth and gets pretty nasty. June gets particularly nasty when she says, you're incapable of love. You created this world. You have no idea what love is. You built this world so you could have somebody, and even that didn't work. You're small, you're cruel, and you're empty, and you're always going to be empty. Serena says, I should have put a ring in that mouth the day that we met you, and June says, I should have let you burn when I had the chance. But the bickering has to stop because now it's finally time to film. And the commander starts off with this ridiculous prayer vigil where June is supposed to kneel down, but she doesn't. All of the handmaids are looking at her waiting for their cue, and eventually she does, but it's her little tiny fuck you to this whole thing. In episode 7, Commander Winslow says that they're still proceeding with the extradition of baby Nicole with Canada, but it's going to take some time. And because it's going to take some time, he wants Commander Waterford to go back home and wait for his reassignment to D.C. This surprises Commander Waterford a little bit, who's got his wife looking at potential houses with Commander Winslow's wife. But alas, he doesn't have a choice. And D.C. isn't exactly what it seems. When Serena's talking to the other wives in D.C., it just seems like they're hinting at a lot of infidelity, and you don't really see that where they live now. Now, on the flip side, up in Canada, Emily is being interviewed by the Swiss because she is still one of the people taking care of baby Nicole, and they're asking her about all the crimes she committed, and they sound pretty bad. All the while, her wife is in the room listening to all of this, and at the end of it, she said, you know, you don't have to do this by yourself, but she feels like she does, because the only person she's really connecting with about what she went through is Moira. They're discussing what they went through in a coffee shop, and Moira says, hey, I got a jet because we're going to protest a Canadian politician who's not staying firm on keeping Nicole in Canada, and Emily says, hey, can I come with? And as with protests go, hey, the more the merrier. At this protest, they accost the politician, and Emily gets really animated, and both Moira and Emily end up getting arrested. And while they're in lockup, they bond even more over what they went through. They start talking about all the people they killed, and Moira says, well, look, how many people have you killed since you got out? And Emily says, none. And she says, exactly. So while those two are bonding over what they went through, in Gilead, June is hanging people along with all the other handmaids. The handmaids get together, and they basically are in charge of pulling the lever of the drop-down floor and hanging criminals. But a lot of these criminals aren't actual criminals. As soon as the execution is done, June drops the rope and says, let's go, we're leaving. As June and Of Matthew quickly leave the scene, Of Matthew makes mention that she heard the reason the woman got hanged is because she mistreated a child. She let the child cry. June says, yeah, that's a good reason to hang somebody, and Of Matthew says, absolutely it is. And right before they're about to argue, Of Matthew starts getting ill. Good old morning sickness. Of Matthew says, you know, I love being pregnant, but this time, you know, I just don't know. June tries to comfort her by saying, you know, when I had Hannah, I had some weird thoughts too. And Of Matthew just cuts her off and says, well, I don't have weird thoughts. Children are a blessing. Yeah, but you can tell she doesn't like it this time. Eventually, the two end up at the market, and June is trying so hard to shake of Matthew. She's able to finally do so thanks to the other handmaids. One of the handmaids asks of Matthew if she can help her pick avocados, and this frees June up, and the other handmaid says, okay, now's your chance, and signals over to where Hannah's Martha is standing. June goes up to the Martha and is seeking help, but the Martha is very reluctant to give it. She does give her an update that she's doing well in school, and June says, how could she be doing well in school? She can't even read. Finally, the Martha gives her a name of a guy at her school and says, ask him, he's a friend, he'll help you out. So now June has a lead, but she has to get to the school first. And to make it worse, of Matthew saw this conversation go down. Now, we don't know if she could hear anything, but she definitely saw something and it's suspicious. Of course, June doesn't know that. Now her focus is on just simply getting to the school. June arrives back at the Lawrence household and asks the Martha if she would go with her to the school, and she says, I'm not helping you. There have been 4 hangings this week. There's tons of soldiers outside. No chance. But June is not deterred. She heads up to Mrs. Lawrence's room, and of course Mrs. Lawrence is stowed away once again. And she opens up the blinds, and you can tell that Mrs. Lawrence is transfixed on the outside. And she asks her, it's a beautiful day. Would you like to go for a walk? Mrs. Lawrence says, I don't think the commander would like that. And she says, I'm sure he'd be fine with it. It would make you happy, right? Let's go for a walk. And Mrs. Lawrence happily agrees. So off June and Mrs. Lawrence go, and after a pretty weird interaction with the Putnams and their baby, where Mrs. Lawrence just keeps repeating, we all thought you were going to die, they get to a bridge and they have a conversation about the Lawrences possibly having children. Mrs. Lawrence mentions that anytime she sees a baby, she starts picturing her baby and if it would be a boy or a girl. And June is very surprised at this and says, you guys tried to have kids? And she said, yeah, we tried, but we were unsuccessful. June decides at this moment to come clean with her and apologizes for lying and explains why they're actually going for a walk. Mrs. Lawrence, upon hearing the story of June and her daughter, processes this and says, okay, let's go. Let's get on the train. I'm up for an adventure. And the two head off to the school. And unfortunately for June, when they arrive, the school is more like a prison. It's walled off. It's got armed guards. It's got a heavily fortified gate. You can't really see inside of it. I'm telling you, this place is not a school. June and Mrs. Lawrence go to the front and ask for that soldier that the Martha gave them, but he's not there, even though he was supposed to be. Mrs. Lawrence says, well, he was supposed to give me a private tour, and they agree because she's a commander's wife, but they don't let June inside. This leaves June on the outside trying to look in, so she starts walking around the building looking for a way she can actually see in, but she can't. She can hear kids, but she can't see them. Eventually, a guard finds her and says, you gotta come with me. And that's where Mrs. Lawrence is outside saying, they told me they were gonna let me see the children. They told me they were gonna let me see the children. And she's frantic about this. When they arrive home, Commander Lawrence seems annoyed about the fact that he has to calm his wife down over this. June apologizes to Commander Lawrence and says, I'm sorry, I was never going to put her in danger, but Commander Lawrence doesn't even acknowledge her. He just walks on by. The next day, there's yet another hanging. This is the 5th one in the week, and right before the handmaids are supposed to pull the lever, one of the handmaids named Alma turns to June and says, yo, what happened to the Mackenzies? They're gone. This is obviously the family that has Hannah, her daughter, and this is the first time June is hearing about this, and she is shocked. To make matters worse, when they look up at the stage of all the people that are being hanged, one of them is Hannah's Martha, the same Martha who gave June the name of the soldier at the school. The Martha is extremely scared, and you can tell that this Martha really did care for Hannah, which makes this even more difficult. And unlike at the beginning of the episode, after they pull the lever, June won't let go of the rope. She finally does, but she's the last one to do so, and she quickly walks through the sea of handmaids and forcibly bumps into Of Matthew. And Of Matthew makes the comment, you should be grateful. And when Of Matthew says this, June stares back at her, enraged. Of Matthew says, I saw you talking to that woman. Aunt Lydia told me to keep an eye on you, and now that temptation is gone. June attacks Of Matthew, screaming, you fucking bitch, do you have any idea what you've done? And to the other handmaids' credits, they let this go on for a little bit, but eventually they have to separate the two. June just storms off, and Of Matthew is left in complete shock and disbelief. In episode 8, we get a lot of backstory on Aunt Lydia. Now, Aunt Lydia in previous episodes had mentioned that she had a nephew, but this isn't entirely true. Aunt Lydia was a school teacher who was waiting one day for a parent to pick up her son way late, and this seemed like a negligent parent. She packed a bag of potato chips for her kid for lunch. Didn't really seem like she had it all together, and finally, right before Aunt Lydia is ready to take this kid home with her, the mom shows up. And when the mom shows up, Aunt Lydia invites both of them over to her house for dinner, and the mom reluctantly agrees. And you find out that this mom is working in a pretty skeevy dive bar and gets accosted by men a lot. The mom's not exactly the best parent, but because of her child, her and Aunt Lydia form kind of a friendship. They end up exchanging Christmas gifts, and one of the Christmas gifts that she ends up getting Aunt Lydia is makeup from her work. At this point, she had dropped the bar gig and ends up working in a department store. It's a sign that this woman is trying to improve her life. Now, at first, upon receiving this gift, Aunt Lydia isn't too thrilled, but the mom says, it just seems like you don't really have anybody. You need to get out there and try. Aunt Lydia did have a previous husband, but that didn't go well, and she really hasn't dated since. So she reluctantly accepts this gift. The mom makes mention that she met a new guy, a guy in IT, and the good news is he's gonna leave his wife for her. And you can tell that this is eating away at Aunt Lydia's moral fiber. She can't stand it, but she does love the kid. A few days later, she uses that makeup and goes out to a club and meets up with the principal of the school for a New Year's Eve party. They have a great time. They go back to her place. They start fooling around a little bit, but he pulls back. When he pulls back, she seems really hurt by this, and it seems like she blames the girl for, quote, putting her in this situation by giving her that makeup and telling her to go out and find somebody. And shortly after, she reports the mom to DHS. And even the principal, who liked her and did want to continue seeing her, is mortified by this action. And this gives you an idea of where Aunt Lydia went wrong and became such a holy roller. But in present-day Gilead, all of the handmaids are in one room helping another handmaid give birth. This handmaid's going through contractions, and while she's going through contractions, all the other handmaids in the room are treating of Matthew like shit. They're giving her dirty looks, they're bumping into her, they're even spitting in her drink. Eventually, though, these contractions subside, and Aunt Lydia decides to send all the girls home. But right before she does so, she tells June, hey, tell your friends to cool it with of Matthew. And June just acts like she has no idea what she's talking about. So Aunt Lydia sees this and says, oh, okay. All right, we can play this game. And has all of the handmaids surround June in a circle with June in the middle and is asking them questions like who's to blame for their deaths, and they all have to point at June and say, she is, she is, she is. It's basically the Handmaid's Tale version of shame from Game of Thrones. Right before it's about to end, June says, Aunt Lydia, I have something to admit. Of Matthew doesn't want her baby. And Of Matthew is mortified, pleading her case, saying it was only for a second. Now, Of Matthew is in the circle getting yelled at. She's getting yelled at that she's a sinner and she's a crybaby, and unlike June, Of Matthew can't take this and she's breaking down. After this display of shaming, the handmaids are sent home, and this is the first time June is able to ask Commander Lawrence about the Mackenzies. So June says, do you have any idea where they went? And Commander Lawrence says, I have no idea. Nobody knows. Don't ever ask me again. The next day, though, all the handmaids are called back in because the contractions have come back. And unfortunately, when the baby is born, the umbilical cord was wrapped around its neck, and the baby doesn't survive. You should thank me for not including that photo in this video. When June goes home, Commander Lawrence asks if it was a boy or a girl, and June says the baby died. Commander Lawrence says, well, we don't have to tell Mrs. Lawrence that. Also, if you could hang out with her tomorrow, that'd be great because you're really good with her. June gets pissed off and says, you know, you act like you care about this woman, but you don't. You know this world that you created isn't good for her, and with one phone call, you could get her out, but you keep her trapped here. You're not protecting her, you're killing her. Commander Lawrence just looks at her and says, yeah, that must have felt good, didn't it? And yeah, it definitely did. And while these two bicker about Commander Lawrence's wife, Aunt Lydia, along with two other aunts, are figuring out where to place the handmaids. And of course, June comes up in conversation. And Lydia makes mention that she never had a problem until the Waterfords, but also, when you factor in the Lawrence household, that household has had issues with Emily and now June acting up. And maybe it's time we just took June out of that household and reassigned her. So she might end up getting moved. The next day, she heads to the market with Of Matthew, and Aunt Lydia asks if she can have a word with June. And Lydia tells her that we're thinking about reassigning you, and June says, well, it's my understanding that Commander Lawrence asked for me personally. And Lydia tells her that there's other commanders more powerful than Commander Lawrence, but Of Matthew is watching this conversation go down, having no idea what they're talking about, and she's quickly losing it. And while this conversation is going down and Of Matthew is trying to figure out what they're talking about, Janine is in her ear trying to comfort her because she feels bad that she's being bullied. Finally, Of Matthew just snaps and starts smashing Janine in the head with a can. You feel bad for Janine. She just keeps getting her ass kicked. A soldier comes over and tries to stop her, but she ends up smashing a jar into his neck and killing him. She grabs the soldier's gun and starts frantically looking around the room, and initially she points it at June, who has this maniacal smile on her face. And June gives her a nod, and when she does so, Of Matthew goes from pointing the gun at June to pointing the gun at Aunt Lydia. And right before she's about to pull the trigger and kill Aunt Lydia, she, in fact, is shot by another soldier in the store. Episode 9 takes place about a month after the incident with Of Matthew, and Of Matthew is being kept alive solely to give birth to this baby. June, on the other hand, is being punished and is being forced to get on her knees and pray for the baby throughout most of the day until this baby arrives. And Lydia has told her that that's your walking partner, and until she leaves, you don't leave. And this is causing June to go absolutely stir crazy. Now, Of Matthew is getting guests like other handmaids and doctors, but the entire time, June is forced to be on her knees praying for the baby. June is noticing every little detail in the room and outside of it, like girls Hannah's age walking by, and she keeps looking for Hannah, but she doesn't see her. At this point, June just wants Of Matthew or the baby, either or, to just die so she can go home. And it looks like that's going to happen when Of Matthew starts having a seizure, but the doctors rush in and do a quick procedure and throw the scalpel in one of those medical waste containers. And June takes note of this, and at night, she goes rummaging around that medical waste bin. Yes, I said she goes rummaging around with her bare hand in a medical waste bin and retrieves the scalpel. That's how deranged she's becoming. And right before she's about to stick it to Of Matthew, Janine walks in. June is a little surprised to see her and asks, "What are you doing here?" And Janine is there because she had another procedure done with her eye. Janine admits that she hasn't been praying for Of Matthew like she's been told to, and she thinks that's why Of Matthew had the seizure. Of course, June just laughs this off, but she sees it as an opportunity to try and manipulate Janine. June says, you know what we should do is try to set her free, and she tries to hand Janine the scalpel, but even Janine isn't buying it. Janine is a little appalled and says, "You can't kill her. You can't kill her and the baby. She's one of us." In a shocking twist, Janine is the voice of reason. June reluctantly agrees to this, although you can tell she doesn't agree at all, and Janine tries to get the scalpel from her, but June pulls back. When June pulls back, Janine gets kind of pissed off and says, "You know, it's always about you. You're just so damn selfish. It's always about you and your problems." June doesn't take kindly to this and kicks her out of the room. But June still has that scalpel. A couple days later, when the soon-to-be father of Matthew's child is in the room along with his wife, girls around Hannah's age walk by the room, and the father comments that he doesn't want those sick girls around Of Matthew or his baby. The doctor says, "Don't worry, they're not sick. They're in here today to see if they're matured enough to have kids of their own." And these girls, by the way, are maybe 14. And this really hits home with June because Hannah's going to be that girl soon. So June, armed with the scalpel, starts looking around the room to figure out who she wants to kill first. The father, the mother, the doctor, and then in walks Serena, and she says, "Yep, that's the person I want to kill first." When everybody is seemingly leaving the room, she calls over Serena, but she's having trouble getting up on her feet because of the fact that she's been on her knees for several months. Even Serena makes note that you don't look well. But June has a mission at hand, and she takes a swipe at Serena, and while she hits her, she doesn't do a whole lot of damage. Serena's able to fight her off, and actually June ends up slicing her own hand open, and Serena leaves the room and tells the doctor what happened. The doctor comes in the room and says, "Yeah, we got to get that stitched up," and just casually walks over, picks up the scalpel, and puts it back in the medical waste bin. June tells him, "If you're just going to report me, there's no point of stitching me up. They're going to kill me." The doctor says, "I took an oath, and I'm not going to abandon that oath. I'm not going to report you." The two end up making small talk, and it turns out that this doctor actually worked with June's mom because June's mom was a doctor. June comes around to asking him if he can euthanize Of Matthew, and he says, "Of Matthew isn't my patient. The baby is. And until the baby comes out, I can't do that." June comes clean and says, "I was going to kill you and the parents and Serena." And the doctor asks, "When did you start having suicidal thoughts?" And she says, "I don't think you heard me correctly. I was going to kill. Homicidal thoughts." And the doctor stays true to his word and says, "If I report what you just told me, you're going to end up on the wall. So let's just call it suicidal thoughts." June tells him, "Probably when I realized I wasn't going to see my daughter anymore." But lucky for June, she won't be waiting much longer because the baby does arrive. It's a baby boy, and June is finally allowed to leave. And as she's leaving, she runs into a little girl, once again about Hannah's age, who is helping her out of the hospital. The little girl asks June if she had a kid, and June says, "No, I was here to visit a sick friend." And the girl says, "Yeah, I'm here just to figure out if I can have kids yet, just as soon as I get married." June looks at her and says, "Do you even want that?" And the little girl says, "Yes, of course." And this little girl is obviously brainwashed. This girl reminds me of a lot of Eden, Nick's former wife. June finally hits the outside world for the first time in months, and Aunt Lydia is there waiting for her, trying to usher her into the van, but a group of young girls pass her, and June walks up to Aunt Lydia and says, "My walking partner hasn't left yet. I'm not leaving." Aunt Lydia loves this and thinks maybe that she finally got through to June, and when June goes back into the hospital, she apologizes to Of Matthew, who obviously can't hear any of this. Of Matthew is basically a vegetable. She tells Of Matthew that now her new plan, instead of trying to get her own daughter out, is going to be to get as many children she can out of Gilead. In episode 10, June is finally allowed home after months of being in the hospital, and some things have changed. Most notably the fact that homes in the area are having to conform to DC regulations, and that includes keeping Commander Lawrence's wife away from the medication she needs. So June walks into this new-look Lawrence household, and the first person she sees is the Martha. And the first thing the Martha says to June is, "Scones mean no." Now, June has no idea what she's talking about, and she says, "I was asking the other Marthas around the area to help out Mrs. Lawrence with the medication that she needs, and when they send scones, that means no." But June doesn't care about scones right now. She tells the Martha about her plan to help get kids out of Gilead, and the Martha looks at her and says, "You're going to get yourself killed," but she does agree to ask around. Later that night, June sees Commander Lawrence for the first time in months, and because June's heard the stories about Mrs. Lawrence being off her meds, she confronts Commander Lawrence and says, "You could have her out of here. You could call a truck and get her into Canada with the snap of your finger, and you're not doing it, because it doesn't seem like Commander Lawrence has any interest in splitting him and his wife up." But life kind of goes back to normal for June as she heads to the market. And because of the new rules and whatnot of trying to conform to DC, there's a lot more security at the market, so there's a lot less gossiping. But that doesn't stop June. She sees her friend Alma and tells Alma about her plan to get kids out of Gilead. And Alma looks at her and says, Are you nuts? Are you feeling okay? And June says, "No, I'm not feeling okay." But June doesn't get a chance to explain herself because an alarm goes off and all of the handmaids are wrangled up and taken to an open outdoor meeting location. And they're taken there because Commander Winslow is in from DC, and Commander Waterford basically just wants to show off his handmaids. But the problem is, Commander Winslow isn't exactly impressed. That's because this area has kind of gone by the wayside with a lot of little tiny details. One of them being that Janine is allowed to have a red eye patch. So it's a lot of little minute details, but Commander Winslow is pointing all of them out. Now, while he's doing this, Commander Waterford goes up to June and mentions her moving to DC. We don't know if this is a threat or if this is a proposition, but June isn't interested in it because it's hard to save the kids of Gilead when you're away in DC. Now, after this display of handmaids, June heads home and asks the Martha where Commander Lawrence is, and he's out for the moment. So June takes it upon herself to start snooping in his office looking for the files of the missing children, but she is caught by Mrs. Lawrence. And Mrs. Lawrence wants to know what she's doing and says, "Are you looking for stuff on your daughter?" And she says, "Actually, I'm looking for stuff on other people's daughters." Mrs. Lawrence says, "Oh, Joseph keeps those files in the basement." And then there's an awkward silence because June doesn't know what to do. And Mrs. Lawrence says, "Well, follow me. I don't have all day." And they go downstairs, and sure enough, it's everything June needs. There's file boxes upon file boxes of all the information on the children of Gilead. What their old name was, what their new name was, medical files, what they look like, where they live, everything that June would need. But it becomes quite clear to June what they were referring to when they said Mrs. Lawrence isn't well, and she tells Mrs. Lawrence, "You could get out of here." And Mrs. Lawrence says, "No, we really can't, because Joseph's a war criminal, and if he leaves, he's going to be hanged. And you know what? He would even deserve it." So that's probably why when June confronted Commander Lawrence, he didn't have much to say. So whether they want to be or not, the Lawrences are stuck in Gilead. And that means Mrs. Lawrence is currently stuck on herbal tea instead of the mood relaxers that she needs because of the DC regulations. So no one's really happy in the Lawrence household currently, except for June, who has those files. And while June combs over those files, Commander Waterford and Commander Winslow, along with Serena, are all having a chat, and Commander Waterford says, "I'm worried about Lawrence." Commander Winslow cuts him off right there and says Lawrence was instrumental in creating this country, and he says, yes, he was, but he's had 4 handmaids, not one of them has gotten pregnant. Something is amiss. Now, we could go over to ensure that he is following protocol, and Serena jumps in and says, "Isn't that a bit much?" Commander Winslow doesn't think so, and says if he can't keep his house in order, how's he supposed to keep this country in order? So they all head over to the Lawrence household, and June is summoned upstairs for her first ever ceremony with Commander Lawrence. Now, this is her first ceremony in well over a year, and this is Commander Lawrence's first ceremony ever. Aunt Lydia lets June know that after the ceremony, she will be inspected by a doctor, and Commander Lawrence, Mrs. Lawrence, and June all head upstairs. Now, initially, Commander Lawrence thinks, all right, we'll just play cards for 20 minutes, we'll go downstairs, we'll tell them we did the damn thing, and then they'll leave. But June says, no, that can't happen, because I'm going to get checked out by a doctor. Unfortunately, we have to do this. And when the reality sets in that the ceremony will go down, Mrs. Lawrence freaks out because Commander Lawrence had told her that he will never have to go through a ceremony. June is hearing this saying, did you really not think that you would have to go through this? I mean, you created this world. And he said every government has exceptions to the rule. Unfortunately for Commander Lawrence, he isn't one of them in this case. And if they don't go through the ceremony, everybody involved is going to die. So while Mrs. Lawrence weeps in the corner, Commander Lawrence and June have to go through the ceremony. And no one seems to really feel great about this, including Serena, who sees that there's something up with Mrs. Lawrence. And when he's about to leave, Fred asks June if she's all right, but June just looks at him and says, at least it wasn't from you, and walks away like a badass. Now later that night, June walks in the kitchen and sees Commander Lawrence, who is drinking, and he tries to give her some birth control, but she says, do you have any idea what the punishment for birth control is? You get ripped apart by dogs. Yeah, I'm good. You can have it. Commander Lawrence then says, if I get you a truck, you have to get my wife out of here. He gets up to leave the room, but June says, you could go too. And you won't even die. You just have to bring them something they want. Bring them the children of Gilead. This seems to really intrigue Commander Lawrence, and he says, yeah, I'd be a hero, and just walks out of the room contemplating this. So as Commander Lawrence contemplates getting the children of Gilead out of Gilead, over at the Waterford household, Serena is pissed because Fred, in her opinion, has gotten distracted from the mission at hand. And the mission at hand is getting baby Nicole back to Gilead. She says, you've been so distracted by getting this promotion to DC that you've forgotten about our daughter who is still in another country. Then she pulls out the phone that was given to her last trip up to Canada and says, I met a person up there. Obviously, this is the person from the American government. And she hands the phone to Commander Waterford and says, all you have to do is cooperate. Now, it's interesting that both Serena and June are telling the men in their life that all you have to do is cooperate with the Canadian government to get your way. The next day at the market, June walks over to Alma and gives her an update on her kid, and she has that update because of the files in Commander Lawrence's office. And this is the first time that she's hearing an update on her child since her child was taken from her. And hearing about her child, it kind of invigorates the handmaids to help June with her mission. And when June gets home to the Lawrence household, the Martha of the house is completely shocked. She says, muffins. Muffins mean yes. June still doesn't know what she's talking about. She says, I asked around if the other Marthas would help with your mission to get kids out. And look, they all sent muffins. And when I'm talking muffins, the whole table is covered in muffins. Episode 11 opens up with Commander Lawrence's wife holding a gun to his head. She's still really, really pissed off that the ceremony went through. And June has to walk in and kind of walk her off the ledge. Mrs. Lawrence is yelling that he raped you, and she says, look, we all could have done something different here, but I need him because I have a plan, and this plan has to work, and I need his clearances, so I need you not to kill him right now. And luckily for everybody in the room, June is able to get the gun away from Mrs. Lawrence. After Commander Lawrence and June put Mrs. Lawrence to bed, she walks downstairs and says, okay, here's the plan. 52 kids are getting out of Gilead. We need more trucks. And that was a lot more than was initially expected. But she's not really giving Commander Lawrence a choice. The next day, the Martha of the house comes to June and says they're here. June has no idea who's here, and she says, look, listen to them. Don't ask any questions. Just answer their questions. And when she goes downstairs, there's about 6 or 7 Marthas kind of challenging June on this whole plan, asking, whose idea was this? Oh, it's yours. Who gave you clearance on this? This is a stupid plan. You're going to get everybody killed. And the real issue is that these Marthas have their own plan. And they're worried about June's plan getting in the way of their plan. Because if June's plan fails, the whole city goes on lockdown and it screws up their original plan. And it seems like this group does truly control the Marthas. Where they go, the Marthas will go, and they can shut down June's entire operation. June pleads her case and says, if we can save 52 kids from this place, why wouldn't you do that? Ultimately, June and the Marthas come to an agreement that June will go through her plan, it won't interfere with the Marthas' plan, and if June is caught, the Marthas aren't coming to save her, she's on her own. It did help that the Martha of the Lawrence household did in fact vouch for June. Afterwards, June goes upstairs and starts asking the Martha about the other Martha's plan, because they had mentioned a plane, some guy's name, and a shipment, and she wants to know what's in the shipment. Now, the Martha doesn't know what's in the shipment, but she does know that a bartender at Jezebel's named Billy is controlling the shipment. June asks, do you trust him? And she says, I trust his love of money more than anything. But the two are interrupted by the other Martha in the house, who they don't really trust yet, and she's holding Mrs. Lawrence's food tray that hasn't been touched. And that's pretty weird that Mrs. Lawrence wouldn't even bring it inside. June asks, well, have you seen Lawrence? And she says, no, I guess he's sleeping in. And when June goes into Commander Lawrence's office, a bunch of books have been shredded, and he just left a note that says, sorry. And understandably so, the entire house at this point, or what's left of it, is freaking out. June says, we probably have 2 days at best to form a plan. And June starts looking through drawers and notes and documents, anything that can help them formulate a plan to save their lives, basically. June is doing this all night, and eventually the door opens, and she hears Commander Lawrence's voice. So the Lawrences have returned, and when he enters his office, there's June waiting for him. And June rips into him, saying, "You made me a promise to help get these kids out," but Lawrence says, "I'm sorry, I have a bigger obligation to my wife than I do you, but I guess I had a change of heart." And June isn't buying that and says, No, that's not it. June says, you can't get out, can you? Commander Lawrence comes clean and says, "There's no clearance level, and I don't have them." And honestly, I don't think that's a coincidence. June asks him if he can get trucks out, and he says, "I can't even get a mouse out at this point. I'm stuck here." Lawrence says, "It's just a matter of time before they come for me, and then they come for you. Now, I'm going to try to find you a nice commander to go to, and I'll try to keep you away from the colonies and Jezebels." But June doesn't want to hear that and says, "You're taking me to the city, and you're taking me to the city right now." So Commander Lawrence, for lack of a better term, is forced to drive June up to Jezebel's, and she sneaks in the back door and locates the bartender named Billy. Now, keep in mind, she's being pretty cagey about this because she's in a whorehouse, she's a female, she's dressed up, she's not trying to look out of place, but she's also not trying to pick up guys either. June starts asking Billy about the plane that he has, and she comes clean that she doesn't want to get out. The plane would be for the Martha, a commander, his wife, and then, oh, by the way, 52 kids. And Billy is stunned and says, "Yeah, there's no way." June says, "I have money," but Billy says it can't be enough. And then she says, "I have a bunch of famous paintings." Because when the government was overthrown, Commander Lawrence raided all of the art museums, and he has a collection that is worth millions. So June offers up some of the art, and Billy says, "I'm still not doing it." June asks, "Well, you'll think about it." Billy says, "No, I won't." So June finally offers up all of the art. June says, "You get all the art, and all you have to do is keep the plane on the ground for a day." But Billy says, "A day? You'll be lucky if it's on the ground for 20 minutes. But this offer of all the art is enough for Billy to at least consider it. June says, "Let me know," and gets up to leave, but she's stopped by Commander Winslow. Commander Winslow wants to know what she's doing there and says, "Did Lawrence bring you here?" And she says, "Yeah." Winslow asks, "Well, then why isn't he in a room with you right now?" And she says, "Well, he just likes me to tell him what goes on here. You know, everybody has their kink." To which Winslow responds with, "Okay, well, let's give him something you can tell him about." He makes June get on a bed, face down, and right before he's about to kind of get into it, June just says fuck it and starts attacking him. They get into an all-out brawl, and it ends with June grabbing a pen and stabbing him repeatedly, getting to her feet, grabbing a statue, and cracking him in the head right after he says, "Please don't, I have a family, I have kids." Obviously the wrong thing to say to a handmaid. So June is sitting there pondering her next move with a dead commander next to her, and there's a knock on the door for housekeeping. And when the housekeeper comes in, she's obviously stunned by what she's seeing, but she also recognizes June, because this is one of the 5 women that June saved that day in the cages at the airport when June was forced to pick 5 of those women to become Marthas. She tells June how to get out of the hotel, what elevator to take, what exit to take, and then with the help of the other Marthas in the hotel, cleans the room spotless and gets rid of the body. The next morning, as June wakes up all bruised up, Commander Lawrence brings her a gun, hands it to her, and says, "They're going to be coming for us." Now, a few people we haven't mentioned in this episode are the Waterfords, who are going to meet with the guy from the American government at a neutral location. And as they're driving, the roads are completely empty. So Commander Waterford lets Serena drive, which is against the law, but nobody's on the road to stop them. They end up taking shelter in a family's home, and it doesn't really seem like they know the family, but Commander Waterford's commander status helps them get a room for the night. The two are having a conversation that night about what life would be like for them if this whole thing had never happened. And Fred says, "Well, I guess I'd still be doing my job and you would be a pundit and a writer." And Serena finally tells him how she feels and says, "I just can't believe that you took that from me." And Fred admits that he had no idea how hard this would be on Serena and apologizes. And it seems like their relationship is getting back on track. And the next day they go to meet with this guy at a neutral location, and he shows up and says, "Hey, follow me up the road. I have a safe place we can talk." But up the road is not just up the road. It's quite a ways. And when Fred finally gets to the car, he's pretty pissed off because he feels like he was led on a wild goose chase. But he doesn't have time to really complain about it because he's being told that he just crossed over to Canada and he's under arrest as a war criminal. All of these soldiers come out of the woods and surround them and start reading Commander Waterford his Miranda rights. Commander Waterford is absolutely floored at this point, and him and Serena are separated and taken away. And this gives you an idea of what would happen to Commander Lawrence if he escaped into Canada. Episode 12 picks up in Canada, where the Waterfords are being held in separate rooms, and Mrs. Waterford is allowed 5 minutes with Fred Waterford. And as soon as he sees Serena, he starts vowing to seek vengeance against those that did him wrong. And she says, "Look, you've got to stop worrying about that, all right? And you've got to stop worrying about me. You've got to start worrying about yourself, because I'll be fine." And it's becoming obvious to everybody in the room that Serena sold him out. He looks at her and says, "What did you do?" And she says, "I guaranteed that I would see my daughter." And Fred looks at her and says, "I just feel bad that the daughter has you as a mother." So Serena walks out of the room because, sticks and stones. And per the arrangement with Canada, she's going to be allowed to see baby Nicole for 1 hour with the social worker present in the room. And Moira brings baby Nicole in, but she doesn't just bring her in without saying something. She has a few choice words for her. Just like with Luke's meeting a couple weeks ago, Moira gives her the dirtiest look and tells her that I'm June's friend and this is June's baby. She then turns to the social worker in the room and says, if you need extra diapers, they're in this pouch. And Serena cuts her off and says, hey, I'm sure she'll be fine. And Moira looks at her and says, well, who even are you? Who even are you to her? You're nobody to her. I'll tell you who you are. You're always going to be the woman who held other women down while your husband raped them. And your husband also raped me too. Jezebel's, yeah, he raped me. The guy from the American government tries to jump in and say she's out of line, but Moira just looks at him and says, fuck you. Eventually, Moira does leave the room for Serena's visit, and it doesn't start off so hot. Baby Nicole is crying quite a bit, and the social worker says, it's, probably a little strange or dangerous situation. So Serena starts trying to comfort Nicole, saying, Nicole, it's mommy. And the social worker cuts her off and says, you can't tell her that. You're going to confuse her. And it's so fitting because this is exactly what Gilead told June about her daughter, and now the shoe is completely on the other foot. Now, while the meeting with Serena and baby Nicole was going down, a meeting between Fred Waterford and Luke was going down. Luke goes in the room and says, I know what you did, and at the end of the day, you're always going to be a man who was betrayed by his wife. Fred kind of chuckles and says, well, what about you? What about your wife? She's not here, and she's not coming here. The reality is the June Osborne that you knew is dead. Gilead changed her. I changed her. And when he says this, Luke freaks out and punches him right in the face. Luke walks out of the room, and you got to imagine it felt pretty good to finally lay his hands on Fred. So there's your Canadian update, but back in Gilead, June is armed with a gun and waiting for soldiers to come in, but when the door opens, it's not soldiers, it's Mrs. Lawrence. She's a little taken aback that June is holding a gun in her face, but says that soldiers are downstairs and they need some tea, and Commander Lawrence just thought that maybe the Martha in the household could use a little help. So June obliges and heads into the room with the tea, and you're overhearing a little bit of the conversation between Commander Lawrence and a couple of the other commanders. And the other commanders are trying to pressure Commander Lawrence into a military attack against Canada because of what happened with the Waterfords. Commander Lawrence is obviously very hesitant to start a war over this. And eventually the commanders leave. And as Commander Putnam is leaving, he looks at June and says, you're probably the only one who's happy about this. Finally, everybody leaves the room and it's just June and Commander Lawrence. And Commander Lawrence tells June exactly what happened with the Waterfords, but he also tells her, as far as everybody's concerned, Commander Winslow has simply disappeared, and they're blaming the Canadian government for this. They think because Canada took Commander Waterford, they must have taken Commander Winslow as well. So Lawrence says, you just got off the wall and away with murder all in one morning. That's a pretty good morning, right? But the good news doesn't stop there because June also learns that Billy from Jezebel's has agreed to her deal. So he's going to supply the plane and she's going to supply the art, and the plane's going to arrive in 7 days. Later that day, June heads to the market and sees Rita and is telling Rita about the plan with the kids, and Rita says that she's proud of her and she'll help in any way possible. And this echoes the sentiment of pretty much all of the handmaids and Marthas in the town. But later that day, Mrs. Winslow along with Mrs. Putnam arrive at the Lawrence household to pray for the safety of Commander Winslow, but also the safety of the Waterfords. So June has to escort Mrs. Lawrence into the room, and shortly after Mrs. Lawrence arrives, Mrs. Winslow asks Commander Lawrence if there's any leads to the whereabouts of Commander Winslow, and he says, no, not that I'm aware of. And she says, well, please try to find him because I can't be kept up in a house with 6 kids. They're going to end up taking some away. And Mrs. Lawrence jumps in the conversation and looks at Commander Lawrence and says, oh, well, we can take some. We can take some with us. We have room, right? Commander Lawrence keeps covering for her, and luckily for them, it doesn't seem like the women are catching on to the fact she keeps saying we can take them with us. The 2 women get up and leave, and now it's just June, Commander Lawrence, and Mrs. Lawrence in the room. And Commander Lawrence is telling her that even with the new clearances back, because Commander Winslow and Commander Waterford are gone, so they've returned his clearances, unfortunately, you have a bunch of trigger-happy politicians that want to go to war with Canada. And they're even talking about closing the border. And if they close the border, that means no plane, and no plane means no escape. So he asks June if she can move up the date, and June says, no, it doesn't really work that way. It's 7 days from now. You got to keep the border open. If this plane arrives early, it's not going to look normal. We're not trying to garner any suspicion here. And while they're having this conversation, Mrs. Lawrence is trying to leave the house because she's seeing kids outside that she can, quote, save. She's saying there's a kid over here I can save. There's a kid over here I can save. What about the kids over in the school? And finally, June just grabs her and yells at her and says, shut up. You cannot tell a soul about this. Commander Lawrence tries to jump in and kind of protect his wife a little bit, But June isn't having it, and June says you should have had her shut up a long time ago. Now, Mrs. Lawrence reluctantly agrees and just slowly heads up to her room. Later that night, June passes by Mrs. Lawrence's room and notices that she hasn't brought in her food, so she grabs it and opens the door, and there she finds Mrs. Lawrence has overdosed on a bunch of pills. Now, initially, she goes to save her, but thinks better of it and realizes that maybe it's better off for everybody if Mrs. Lawrence isn't in the picture. So she slowly backs out of the room, closes the door, and puts the tray down for a Martha to find her the next morning. And sure enough, the Martha does find her. Mrs. Lawrence is dead, and now we're planning a funeral. Now, the good news is, because of the fact she died, Commander Lawrence has a sympathy angle for him, and the politicians have agreed to keep open the border. So, June's plan is still on. And finally, we move on to the season finale, episode 13, and up in Canada, Serena has been given some security clearance, and she'll even be allowed to leave the facility in about a week. Kind of a good behavior gets rewarded sort of situation. Now, her husband, on the other hand, is being interrogated still, and he's cooperating, giving the information they're looking for, how Gilead operates and whatnot. And during this interview process, the guy from the American government walks in, and Commander Waterford says, I've got some heinous crimes to report regarding Mrs. Waterford. The guy informs Commander Waterford that because of her plea deal, anything that Serena did in Gilead was an act of the state. And Fred says, no, this doesn't have to do with Gilead. It's way worse than that. And later that night, as Serena is having her weekly meeting with Nicole, she is stopped and arrested for the rape of June Osborne and forcing June to have a relationship with her driver in order to have baby Nicole. And this completely breaks their plea deal, and now both Waterfords are in custody. But speaking of June, she's walking through town, and as she's doing so, a bunch of handmaids are dropping items into her bag that she can use for the escape tonight. But she comes across Aunt Lydia, and Aunt Lydia is a little suspicious of why all of a sudden she's the most popular girl in town. Aunt Lydia tells her that, the girls do look up to you, and June says, I know. She said, well, you gotta give them something to look up to. But June is simply yesing her to death to get rid of her. She eventually arrives home to the Martha of the house, who is sick with nerves. And the younger Martha in the house, well, no one respects her. She's trying to help, but June kind of just keeps pushing her away. To her credit, the girl eventually pushes back and says, I'm not a fucking child. I was training to be a radiologist before this whole thing went down. So June says, okay, well then stop waiting for someone to hold your hand and do something. So she does. And when Commander Lawrence walks in the room and asks her if she can press his shirt, initially she starts to say yes, but then she says, no, actually, I'm helping June right now. And the reason Commander Lawrence needs his shirt pressed is because he's got a ton of meetings. And the good news is, because of these meetings, it'll likely push security away from their area, which will help them out a lot. So Commander Lawrence heads off to his meetings, and all of the handmaids and Marthas are preparing for the event tonight. June heads outside for a quick second to dump a bucket and notices that there is a Martha hiding in the woods with a little girl, and it's way too early for them to start arriving. But unfortunately, the Martha tells her that this was really the only time that they could escape, and they traveled a long way, so they usher them into the house, and June starts patching up the kid a little bit because that kid had to walk a little ways. And while she's getting patched up, the little girl asks June if she remembers what the world is like, and more importantly, does she know what Canada's like? And June says, yeah, it's a lot like what it was before this whole thing went down, but the little girl doesn't remember because she's too young. The only world that this girl has ever known is Gilead. June looks at her and says, you can be whatever you want in Canada. You don't have to marry somebody if you don't want to marry somebody. You can just be you. Little girl says, will God still love me because of this? And June says, yes, God will still love you because you're you. But the two are interrupted by the Martha who brought her there because the Martha is spooked. She keeps repeating that we gotta go, this is wrong, I never should have done this, let's go, I'm taking her back. But June isn't going to allow that. She casually walks upstairs, grabs the gun, and right before the Martha and the child leave the house, June yells, hold it. The kid isn't going anywhere. Now, if you want to go, you can, and I'm going to end up shooting you because of it, but no kid should have to grow up in Gilead, so that kid is staying put. So June is able to grab the child, but the Martha runs away. June runs outside to go shoot her, but she can't bring herself to do so. And all of a sudden, she hears a noise from behind her and whips around, and now she's pointing the gun in the face of the little girl. And for whatever reason, she doesn't really put her hand down. And finally, the Martha of the Lawrence household grabs the little girl, ushers away, and kind of scolds June for pointing a gun at a child. But June's slowly becoming a savage. Now, a little while later, Commander Lawrence arrives home, and June says, this is early for you to be home. You're supposed to be in meetings right now. And Lawrence tells her, well, I just want to let you know that somebody spotted a Martha and a child a little while ago, and it's only a matter of time before they start sweeping the area and going house to house. They're going to end up putting roadblocks up, so do me a favor, just make sure that kid that's here ends up getting back home safely. But June says, no, that kid's not going anywhere. I'm not putting that child back so she can get married off at 14 and get raped. Lauren says, stop. She's a commander's daughter. She's going to be fine. But June says, no, I'm not doing it. I'm not taking her back and putting her back in that household. Commander Lawrence says, I'm pulling the plug on this whole thing. It's over. And June says, you're not pulling the plug on anything. I'll tell you what you're going to do. You're going to go in your office. You're going to find me a map and you're going to find me a way out of here. The whole while, by the way, she is holding the gun that he gave her. Commander Lawrence tries to remind her that she's under his roof, and June just laughs it off and says, you're not in charge. And do you honestly think that this is still your house? So go to your office and get me a map. And he does. Just as directed, he goes to his office and he gets her a map. So June, a couple of Marthas, and a couple of handmaids start combing over the map and looking over routes that can take them from the Lawrence household to the airport. And the Martha of the house that wasn't well respected says, why don't you just go through the woods? It's a lot quicker and you'll stay off the main roads. And that's what they agree to do. And for the rest of the night, kids start arriving at the house along with their handmaids or their Marthas. And as they pile into the Lawrence household, the handmaid of the Lawrence household makes mention that this is way more than 52 kids. June steps downstairs to see what's going on, and sure enough, yeah, there's a ton of kids. And they're all having a story read to them by Commander Lawrence, who's trying to distract them before they have to leave. But they're going to have to leave sooner than expected because Janine shows up telling them that they're going door to door now looking for that missing child. The child's parents were drugged by that Martha, but they've since woken up and noticed that their kid is missing, and it's only a matter of time before they arrive at the Lawrence household and find a basement full of children. So June, all of the Marthas and handmaids, and all of the children end up leaving, and June does have a heartfelt goodbye with Commander Lawrence and heads through the woods along with everybody else. They're able to avoid the roads and avoid the security details, and they do make it to the airport. But the problem is there's a security detail that is blocking their way. And to make it worse, they can see the plane. So they desperately need a distraction, and June takes it upon herself. She tells them, all right, you take the kids around the back, and I'll head the other way and distract these two soldiers, and they won't even notice you guys sneaking up from behind them. And June's going to do this all by herself so that everybody can escape. She makes Rita, the handmaid from the Waterford household, promise that Rita will get all the kids on the plane, and Rita agrees. So now June has to figure out exactly how she's going to distract these two soldiers. She realized that her best option is probably just to chuck a rock at them, so she picks up a rock, and just before she's about to throw it at him, she hears a noise from behind her, and it's a bunch of the other handmaids who have come back to help her out. It's a real girl power moment, and they all pick up rocks and start chucking it at the soldiers and their vehicle. And of course, the soldiers are taken completely off guard. And it's working. The kids are escaping, and the soldiers are now just focused on whoever is throwing rocks at them from the woods. Eventually, June ends up popping up and is intentionally seen and chased through the woods by one of the soldiers. The soldier ends up shooting June, and June hits the floor, and when the soldier goes to check on her, June rolls over and shoots him. The soldier's not dead, however, and June holds a gun to his head and tells him, tell whoever's in charge that the checkpoint is clear. He does as directed, and then June kills him. And now June's just lying in the middle of the woods, shot, but she's able to see the plane take off with all of the kids of Gilead and a lot of Marthas as well. June is eventually found by all the handmaids who helped her with the distraction. They end up picking her up and carrying her back to Gilead. The plane arrives in Canada and is greeted by a refugee staff that features Moira and Luke and Emily. And the refugee staff doesn't really know what to expect from this plane. They just know that people from Gilead are on it. And when Moira goes on the plane, she sees all of these kids and is completely taken aback and is in shock. And front row center is the little girl who was the first one to arrive, who was asking June earlier about what it's like in Canada. And the little girl asks Moira, is this where I can be anything I want to be? And Moira says, absolutely, come with me. And all the kids start getting off the plane. And as that little girl reaches the bottom of the steps, Moira asks her, what's your name? And the little girl is kind of trying to think, and then all of a sudden, a guy from across the room says, Rebecca? And the girl starts crying and ends up running up to him because this guy is her dad. So this little girl, because of June, has been reunited with her father. But unfortunately, this gives hope to Luke that June and his daughter is going to be on this plane, and obviously they're not. So when everybody comes off the plane, Luke is a little disappointed, and one of those people who came off the plane was Rita. And when Rita sees Emily, she hugs her and is introduced to Luke, and she says, you're Luke. Oh my God, well, this was all June. June did all of this. And obviously Luke is happy to hear this and is proud of his wife, but he's still disappointed because he hasn't been reunited with either his wife or his daughter. And that is how season 3 of The Handmaid's Tale ends. So do me a favor, like this channel. Like the video. Subscribe to the channel. That'd be cool. And if you know anybody who does like The Handmaid's Tale and would be interested in this video, if you could share it on social media, that would be great. I'd appreciate it. And feel free to write any predictions in the comment section about season 4.